Hello to each and every one of you, and welcome to this channel. In today's topic, I'll be exploring the shadow self, and in general, on this channel, I like to talk about topics of the shadow self, abnormal psychology, and some of the darker parts of our personality that are very difficult to talk about, explain, and understand. You will notice that the comments below have been disabled, as I feel this distracts from the message, but please feel free to give feedback using the thumbs up or thumbs down. And if there's anything further you'd like to get across, please kindly email me. Socials will also be listed below. And I also sometimes like to include, or most times like to include, the sources that I read from, but also the content that I use creating this channel is sometimes more of a metaphorical description from some of the nuances I get from my clinical practice as a clinical psychologist. So on to the shadow self. I'd like to start by explaining the shadow self by using a very palpable example. So let's actually explain the shadow self or compare it to an actual shadow. So imagine for a while that you are blindfolded and you're walking in a park. And let's say this park is occupied by trees in certain spaces, and some spaces just plain grass with sunlight. And so you're walking blindfolded. And as you're walking across the different spots, those that are shaded and those that are not, you can begin to sense or feel something come over you, whether if it's because of the coolness, or even if your eyes are closed, you can still sort of perceive that the lightness of the environment has changed to something that's a little bit more dimmer or darker. So in the same way, the shadow self is something that can be sensed and felt and perceived, even though it's not necessarily an object. And it can also be perceived and felt, even though sometimes someone is not necessarily 110% aware of it. Okay, so let's now say you are still in the same park, and let's say now you are no longer blindfolded, and still it's sunny. There's some sunny parts of the grass and some which are completely exposed to the sun. So even still as you're walking now, you can not only feel and sense the shadow or the shade that comes with the trees that's created by the sunlight, but you can also see it and perceive it. But even if you had to try and reach out and grab it, you can't hold it or catch it. And even if you had to try and push it away, you can't push it away, but you can, it impacts you. You can feel the coolness over it. So in the same way, the shadow self in psychology is something that we can perceive. And even if sometimes we are aware of it, we are aware of those parts of ourselves which are difficult to understand, which are parts of ourselves which may cause conflicts in other people, or the parts of ourselves which are selfish or greedy or manipulative or insecure or scared. And those parts of ourselves that may make others feel uncomfortable around us or make us difficult people to be around in certain circumstances. The shadow self is not something that you can just approach directly. The same way as you cannot approach a shadow, a physical shadow on the floor directly, catch it or find a way to push it away. So as we now shift from more of a physical example of what a shadow is to what a psychological shadow self is, you may start to see the similarities in how a shadow actually represents a parts of ourselves which are elusive and parts of ourselves which are less visible and captured or less easier to explain, and those parts of ourselves which are hidden. And it's actually for this reason why the shadow remains very difficult at times to work with. So even though our shadow selves can be seen as quite elusive and difficult to work with, because they can't be exactly approached directly, and practical methods cannot be used to kind of approach them and resolve some of the things that are part of our shadow selves, it still remains something very beautiful to explore. So for example, our shadow selves are markers of the things that we still need to work on and areas of our lives where we need to bring light into. So, for example, a shadow is not complete darkness. In order for a shadow to exist, there has to be some light. So, what that basically means is Our shadows become ways of teaching us of things that we need to work on and aren't necessarily or don't actually have to be necessarily seen as something negative. So, in our psychological journeys or in the journey of life, we're tasked with challenges of working with different aspects of ourselves, which are more opaque, murky, to allow light to come through. Objects which block the light from going through, casting a shadow, is ourselves in the present, and the shadow is the near future, whereas the light is the final future.
So, if we look at this diagram that is now in front of you, the self is something that can be seen. Let's say, for example, this torch that's at the beginning of the diagram. And the light is the self, and it passes on, and the past, present, and future is the journey that the self takes. So, because of some of the challenges that we faced in the past, the experiences we've had, painful experiences we've had with family members and friends, these painful experiences have the potential to become objects that block the light from the true self to come through, which then casts a shadow into our present selves. And this is why it's important to work on these challenges and these painful experiences from childhood and different experiences throughout life, so that these don't contribute to the shadow selves, part of ourselves, which we haven't worked on or we find are very difficult to work on. And once these things have been worked on, a person can actually learn how to let the light pass through these objects and painful experiences, and then therefore their shadow selves dissipate and they become more of a being, you can say, of light, and that is out in the open completely.
So, in our psychological journeys or in the journey of life, we're tasked with challenges of working with different aspects of ourselves, which are more opaque, murky, to allow light to come through. Objects which block the light from going through, casting a shadow, is ourselves in the present, and the shadow is the near future, whereas the light is the final future.
And I specifically say the light is the final future, as that's generally tends to be the goal for therapy or shadow work, which is to understand why are you that way without judging yourself, or understanding this parts of yourselves which are the shadow self, so that you can become a better version of yourself.